I led 15 Muslim men into a Christian church to destroy their worship service, convinced with every breath in my chest that we were defending Allah by humiliating infidels in their own building. I believed this with a calm that now terrifies me. I believed it the way a man believes gravity exists, the way he believes fire burns. There was no hesitation in me, no internal argument, no moral friction. I did not feel like a criminal. I felt like an instrument, chosen, necessary, clean. That is my confession.
And I need to say this clearly, before anything else. I did not think I was evil. I thought I was faithful. I thought I was disciplined where others were weak. I thought I was brave enough to do what most believers only whispered about in frustration and prayer. I was convinced that God's honor was under attack and that He required men like me to defend it with action, not words. I did not wake up one morning filled with hate. Hate is too simple a word. What grew inside me was something colder, more organized, more respectable. It grew slowly, fed by certainty and repetition, by voices I trusted, by a world that felt increasingly hostile to everything I had been taught to revere. It grew the way rust grows on metal, not suddenly, but inevitably, silently, until the structure underneath is no longer sound. My faith began as obedience, as routine, as inheritance. I was raised to believe that God was not to be questioned, only obeyed. That submission was the highest virtue. That doubt was not curiosity, but corruption. From my earliest memories, I understood that the world was divided cleanly into what was pure and what was impure, what was acceptable and what was forbidden, who belonged and who did not. There was comfort in that clarity. Comfort in knowing exactly where you stood and exactly where others did not. As a boy, I was not violent. I was quiet, observant. I watched adults closely. I learned early which questions earned approval and which earned silence. I learned how to read a room, how to measure myself against expectations, how to suppress impulses that did not align with the image of righteousness I was taught to admire. I wanted to be good, not kind, good. There is a difference, though I did not know it then. Good meant controlled. Good meant obedient. Good meant unquestioning. As I grew older, I became more serious, more rigid. The world outside our community felt chaotic, loud, indulgent. And the more chaotic it felt, the more I clung to structure. Rules were safety. Certainty was protection. I did not realize that I was slowly replacing trust in God with trust in systems, slogans, and men who spoke with absolute confidence. Those men came into my life gradually. They were older, respected, disciplined. They spoke with authority and never apologized for it. They did not entertain nuance. They did not hesitate. Their faith was sharp-edged and efficient. They did not waste time on compassion that, in their words, only emboldened enemies. I admired them deeply. They talked about honor constantly, about humiliation as a weapon, about strength as the highest expression of devotion. They taught that patience had limits, that tolerance was being exploited, that the world only respected force. And they framed all of it as love for God. Love fierce enough to confront. Love brave enough to act. When I listened to them, something inside me settled. The unease I felt when exposed to other beliefs, other ways of worship, other claims about God, it finally had an outlet. My discomfort was no longer weakness. It was discernment. My anger was no longer personal. It was righteous. Christians, in particular, became a symbol in my mind. Not individuals, not neighbors, not people with histories and fears and families. Symbols. Their churches stood openly, without shame. Their worship was public, audible, visible. Bells, songs, gatherings. To me, that visibility felt like an insult, like provocation masquerading as peace. Why should they worship freely? Why should their faith occupy space so confidently? Why should their God be proclaimed openly while ours was constantly defended? I did not ask these questions with curiosity. I asked them with accusation. And each unanswered question hardened into resentment. The group gave me language for that resentment. They gave me justification. They taught me that humiliation was sometimes necessary to restore balance. That fear was a legitimate tool. That public disruption sent a message no sermon ever could. And because these ideas were wrapped in religious vocabulary, they felt holy, clean, untouchable. We did not call what we planned violence. We called it correction. We did not see ourselves as aggressors. We saw ourselves as guardians. Men willing to protect God's honor when others were too passive, too afraid, too compromised. The first time I crossed a line in God's name, my heart raced afterward. I remember sitting alone, breathing hard, my hands trembling slightly. I told myself it was adrenaline, zeal, passion, proof that I cared deeply. Over time, that trembling stopped. The actions became easier, my movements more precise, my emotions more muted. That calm should have frightened me more than it did. But calm felt like maturity, like progress. Then the idea of the church was introduced. It was not shouted. It was not emotional. It was discussed like strategy. Quietly, carefully. A Christian church. A scheduled service. A predictable gathering. We would not destroy the building. That would be crude, they said. We would destroy the moment. Interrupt their worship. Break their sense of safety. Humiliate them publicly, in their own sacred space. 15 men would be enough. Enough to overwhelm without chaos. Enough to control without losing discipline. Enough to make a statement that would echo long after we left. I was chosen to lead. When they told me, I felt something expand inside my chest. Pride, yes, but more than that, validation. As if my years of discipline, suppression, obedience, and hardening had finally been recognized. I felt elevated, trusted, necessary. This was not coincidence. This was destiny. That night, I prayed longer than usual. Not asking whether this was right, I already believed it was, but asking for steadiness, for resolve, for the ability to act without hesitation or mercy rising at the wrong moment. I asked God to make my hands firm and my heart unmoved. I told Him I was ready. I told Him I would defend His honor. I told Him I would not fail. What I did not say, what I could not allow myself to think, was how desperately I needed this act to silence something inside me. I needed certainty. I needed proof that my faith was real, strong, undeniable. I needed to feel aligned with God, not just obedient to rules. The morning we walked toward the church, the air felt heavy, like the world was pressing down on my skin. My body felt tense but controlled. The men followed me closely, watching my movements, listening to my voice. I spoke with confidence, with authority, with the tone of someone convinced that history was leaning in his favor. I did not feel fear. I felt purpose. I could not have imagined that this purpose was about to collapse. That everything I believed about God, strength, honor, and faith was about to fracture in a single, unbearable moment. That the hand I believed was raised for God would be stopped, not by force, not by argument, but by something I had never prepared for. Truth. And that truth was waiting for me inside a church I was determined to destroy. By the time we reached the church, something inside me had already narrowed. My thoughts were no longer scattered. They had aligned into a single forward motion. My breathing was controlled, my steps measured, my body disciplined the way I had trained it to be. I was not nervous. I was alert. There is a difference. Nervousness doubts itself. Alertness believes it is necessary. The men followed close behind me. 15 bodies moving with one intention. We did not need to speak. The plan had been repeated enough times that it lived in our muscles now. We had rehearsed the angles, the pacing, the order of movement. Everything had been reduced to function. That reduction felt holy to me then. Clean. Purposeful. The church stood ahead of us, quiet and unremarkable, and that bothered me more than grandeur would have. There was no defiance in its shape, no aggression in its presence. It simply existed, as if it belonged there. That calm felt like arrogance, like permission it had never earned. I remember thinking that places like this survived only because no one had been willing to confront them directly. As we drew closer, Sound slipped through the doors, singing. Not loud, not triumphant, not theatrical. Just human voices layered together, uneven and sincere. For a brief moment, the sound slowed me internally, like friction against my resolve, but I pushed through it immediately. Music was manipulation. Emotion was distraction. We were not here to feel. We were here to act. I stepped forward and opened the door. The shift was immediate. The warmth of the room wrapped around me, carrying the faint smell of old wood and fabric, something lived in and familiar. The singing broke apart mid-note as eyes turned toward us. Silence fell hard, heavy, complete. I felt it land on my skin like pressure. That silence told me everything I needed to know. We had taken control of the moment. I raised my voice and spoke with authority, not shouting, not rushed, but deliberate. The kind of tone that does not ask for attention because it assumes it. Chairs scraped as some of the men moved outward, just as planned. Someone inhaled sharply. A child whimpered and was pulled close. These sounds registered distantly, like background noise to a scene whose center was already fixed. I told myself again that this was necessary. That discomfort was instructional. That humiliation corrected imbalance. I believed that if God disapproved, He would intervene. The fact that my feet were steady, my voice firm, my body responsive felt like confirmation. Heaven was silent, and I mistook that silence for agreement. As I moved deeper into the room, scanning faces, something unexpected unsettled me. I did not see hatred looking back at me. I did not see mockery or resistance. I saw shock, fear, confusion, ordinary human reactions stripped bare. These were not warriors. They were not provocateurs. They were people who had come to worship and had found themselves suddenly exposed. That realization should not have mattered. And yet, it slowed me. Just enough to notice it. The deeper I walked, the heavier the air felt, as if the space itself resisted what I carried into it. My collar felt tight against my neck. Heat built under my skin. I could feel sweat forming along my spine, my pulse rising. I was aware of my men behind me, waiting. They needed a focal point, a defining act. Something that would seal this moment and send the message clearly. And that was when I saw her. She was seated near the front, slightly to the side, small and fragile in a way that age makes unavoidable. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Her posture was upright but unguarded. She had not turned to face us yet, not because she was unaware, but because she did not move with urgency. That stillness irritated me more than panic would have. When she finally lifted her head and our eyes met, I felt something shift that I could not name. There was no fear in her expression, no challenge, no anger. What I saw instead was a depth of sadness and something like compassion, as if she was seeing past my posture, past my voice, past the group behind me, and into a place I kept locked and defended. My chest tightened. I dismissed it instantly. This was not the time for introspection. This was the moment to assert control. I stepped closer and raised my hand. In my mind, this was not violence. It was symbolism. A calculated act meant to humiliate, not injure. I told myself that distinction mattered, that it preserved righteousness. My arm lifted smoothly, confidently, exactly as I intended. And then it stopped. Not gradually. Not hesitantly. It stopped as if seized from the inside. My muscles locked. My breath caught mid-inhale. The room tilted, not physically, but perceptually, like the foundation of everything I stood on had shifted a fraction of an inch and thrown off my balance. I tried to force my arm forward. I couldn't. Sound dulled around me, as though distance had suddenly stretched between me and the room. My vision narrowed until all I could see was her face, clearer and sharper than anything else. Heat surged through my chest and down my arms, flooding my hands until they trembled. My heart, which had been steady moments before, began to pound uncontrollably. Panic rose, sharp and unwelcome. This was not discipline. This was not control. This was exposure. Without warning, memories surfaced, uninvited, relentless. Faces I had dismissed. Words I had spoken with cruelty disguised as truth. Moments I had justified and never revisited. They crashed into me all at once, overwhelming my senses. My stomach clenched. My knees weakened. I felt sick, unsteady, as if my body was rebelling against the role I had forced it to play for years. She did not move. She did not raise her hands. She did not beg. She did not curse me. Her lips shifted slightly. I do not know if she spoke. I do not know if any words were said. But something inside me gave way completely. Not cracked, collapsed. The structure that had held my certainty together fell inward with terrifying speed. I felt suddenly small. Uncovered. Known. The God I thought I was defending did not feel distant or abstract in that moment. He felt unbearably close. Not aligned with my raised hand. Not standing behind my authority. But pressing against my chest, exposing every false belief I had wrapped myself in for safety. My arm began to shake. Then my shoulders. Then my entire body followed. Tears burned behind my eyes, shocking in their intensity. I had not cried in years. I hated what crying represented. And yet my body betrayed me without permission. I lowered my hand without choosing to. I staggered back a step. The room remained silent. I could feel the confusion ripple through the men behind me. This was not the outcome they expected. This was not the victory we had prepared for. My breathing broke into uneven gasps. My chest felt tight, as though it might collapse inward. Nausea rolled through me. The heat that had flooded me now turned into something else, release mixed with terror. In that moment, I understood with horrifying clarity that there was no returning to who I had been minutes before. Whatever had stopped me was not fear of consequences, not weakness, not hesitation. It was truth. And it was undoing me from the inside. My knees gave out, not symbolically, not deliberately, but completely. I collapsed to the floor in front of people I had come to humiliate, unable to hold myself upright any longer. That was the moment my old life began to die. Even though I did not yet understand what it would cost me to let it die. I do not remember deciding to stay on my knees. I only remember realizing that I could not stand again. My body no longer felt like something I commanded. It felt occupied, claimed by a force that did not ask for permission and did not explain itself. The floor beneath me was cold and solid, grounding me in a way my beliefs never had. My palms pressed against it instinctively, as if I were trying to hold myself together, as if touch itself could keep me from dissolving. Time stopped behaving normally. Seconds stretched, thick and heavy, while my thoughts came apart all at once. I could hear my breathing, loud and uneven, echoing in my own head. Every inhale felt too shallow. Every exhale felt like something leaving me that I could never reclaim. The silence in the room was complete, but inside me there was noise, memory, fear, realization colliding violently. I had come here to control a moment, and instead I was trapped inside one. My chest burned. Not with anger now, but with exposure. It felt as though something invisible was pressing against my ribs from the inside, forcing everything hidden upward. I became acutely aware of my heartbeat, fast and erratic, no longer obedient to discipline or training. Sweat ran down my neck and spine, not from exertion, but from the sheer intensity of what was happening inside me. I tried to pray. The words did not come. The phrases I had memorized since childhood, the ones that always surfaced automatically in moments of stress, were gone. It was as if my mind had been stripped of its armor. All I could produce were fragments, half-formed thoughts, broken pleas, raw awareness. I realized, with a shock that cut deeper than fear, that I had never prayed without control before. I had only recited. I had only asserted. This was something else entirely. I lifted my head slowly. The elderly woman was still there. Still seated. Still calm. She was not triumphant. She was not vindicated. She did not look at me as a defeated enemy. She looked at me the way someone looks at a man drowning, without judgment, without satisfaction, only with a steady presence that refuses to look away. That look broke something final inside me. I felt seen in a way I had spent my entire life avoiding. Images flooded my mind with brutal clarity. Moments I had reinterpreted for years suddenly stripped of justification. I saw myself laughing when I should have intervened, remaining silent when silence cost someone dignity, speaking harshly when kindness would have required courage. Each memory landed with physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I felt I might collapse inward completely. I had told myself that cruelty could be holy, that humiliation could be righteous, that strength required hardness. And now, kneeling on a church floor, I felt the full, unbearable realization that none of it had been true. The God I encountered in that moment did not feel like the one I had been defending. This presence was not impressed by my certainty or intimidated by my anger. It did not argue with me. It did not negotiate. It simply revealed me to myself. Every false motive, every hidden fear, every place where I had used God's name to shield my own pride. The realization was devastating. I felt grief rise in me, sudden and overwhelming. Not just regret, but mourning. Mourning for the man I thought I was becoming. Mourning for the years I had spent building an identity on domination instead of truth. Mourning for the people I had reduced to symbols so I would not have to see their humanity. My shoulders began to shake uncontrollably. I pressed my forehead to the floor, not out of ritual, but out of necessity. I could not hold my head up anymore. Tears came then, violent and unstoppable, cutting through me with a force that felt almost humiliating. I had spent years mastering control, and now control had abandoned me entirely. I was not crying quietly. My body convulsed with it. I heard murmurs somewhere around me, distant and indistinct. Movement. Shifting. But none of it mattered. The only reality that existed was the unbearable weight lifting and crushing at the same time. It felt like something was being torn out of me while something else was being pressed in, something I did not yet understand but already knew I could not reject. I remember thinking, with sudden clarity, that if this was God, then I had never known him. That thought terrified me more than punishment ever could, because it meant everything I had built my life on was wrong. I had believed that God was honored by fear. Here, fear dissolved. I had believed that God required domination. Here, domination collapsed. I had believed that God stood with the strong. Here, strength was kneeling. The presence I felt did not excuse me. It did not minimize what I had done or planned to do. But it did something far more destabilizing. It invited me to see myself without defenses. To stop hiding behind ideology. To stop calling my pride obedience. I realized then that surrender was not weakness. It was exposure. And exposure was unbearable. My mind raced forward instinctively, grasping at consequences. My group. My mentors. My family. Everything I was about to lose flashed before me in rapid succession. I understood in that instant that this moment could not be undone. That whatever was happening inside me would not remain private. I could not stand up, leave, and pretend nothing had changed. The cost loomed enormous. And still, I could not resist. I did not choose surrender. It overtook me. Somewhere between the tears and the shaking, between the memories and the presence pressing against my chest, a thought formed that felt less like language and more like truth itself. If this God is real, then he is nothing like the one I was serving. That realization did not bring relief. It brought terror. Because if this God was real, then everything would have to change. Not partially. Not symbolically. Completely. My identity. My loyalties. My understanding of honor and faith and strength. All of it would have to be rebuilt from the ground up, and I had no idea how to survive that process. I stayed there longer than I can measure. Time had lost meaning. When I finally became aware of the room again, I felt emptied, drained, fragile, like a man who has been stripped of armor in the middle of a battlefield and left standing anyway. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I could never return to who I had been, even though I did not yet know who I was becoming. And that knowledge, more than fear or shame or grief, was what finally broke me open completely. I did not walk out of that church as a new man. Not immediately. What I walked out as was something far more dangerous in my world, uncertain, exposed, and internally divided. My body left the building, but my old identity did not follow me. It stayed behind on that floor, shattered into pieces I could no longer reassemble, no matter how desperately I tried. The men who had followed me in did not look at me the same way when we left. Their eyes carried confusion first, then suspicion, then something harder. I felt it without a word being spoken. Leadership depends on certainty, and I no longer had it. Whatever authority I had carried into that church evaporated the moment I collapsed. In our world, breaking publicly is not forgiven, it is remembered. I told myself in the days that followed that it had been a moment of weakness. Emotional overload. I tried to replay it differently in my mind, to dull its edges, to explain it away as exhaustion or confusion. But my body refused to cooperate with the lie. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again. The presence, the exposure, the unbearable clarity. My hands remembered what my mind tried to deny. Sleep abandoned me. When it came, it brought dreams I did not recognize as my own. I saw faces from the church. Not accusing. Not triumphant. Just present. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my chest tight with a grief I had no vocabulary for. Prayer, as I had always known it, felt empty now. The words fell flat, like tools designed for a structure that no longer existed. The group noticed the change quickly. Questions were asked, quietly at first, then directly. I was warned about doubt, reminded of responsibility, urged to correct myself before confusion became contamination. The men I had once trusted spoke to me with the same certainty I had admired, and for the first time, it sounded hollow. Their words no longer settled my unrest. They aggravated it. I realized then that I was standing on a fault line. One step back into certainty would cost me my integrity. One step forward into truth would cost me everything else. The pressure was immense. Reputation, family, safety, belonging. All of it hung in the balance. I understood, with terrifying clarity, that whatever had happened to me in that church was not a private spiritual experience. It was a rupture. And ruptures demand consequences. I began to read in secret. Not to argue. Not to prepare counterpoints. But because I could not stop myself. The words of the New Testament unsettled me in ways I did not expect. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because they felt alive, confrontational in their gentleness. I saw strength redefined, power inverted, authority expressed through sacrifice rather than domination. Every page pressed against the wound that had opened inside me. I resisted for as long as I could. Not because I didn't believe, but because I did. Belief was the problem. If Christ was who he claimed to be, then he was not an addition to my life. He was a replacement. There would be no blending, no compartmentalizing, no quiet adjustment. Following him would cost me the version of myself that had kept me safe in my world. It would turn allies into threats and certainty into exile. I delayed surrender the way a man delays stepping off a cliff he knows he must jump from. Counting costs. Imagining outcomes. Bargaining with God for a less total transformation. But truth does not negotiate. It waits. When I finally surrendered, it was not dramatic. No crowd. No spectacle. Just a quiet moment of exhaustion, alone, admitting what I could no longer deny. I was wrong about God. I was wrong about strength. I was wrong about faith. And I needed mercy more than I needed to be right. The losses came quickly after that. Some relationships ended without explanation. Others ended with anger. Doors closed. Warnings followed. I learned what it meant to be watched differently, spoken about cautiously, avoided altogether. There were moments when fear gripped me so tightly I wondered if obedience had been a mistake. Moments when loneliness felt heavier than truth. But there was something else too. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on agreement or safety, but a steady presence that did not leave when consequences arrived. The same presence I had felt in that church followed me into isolation, into rejection, into uncertainty. It did not promise ease. It promised companionship. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding of identity. I learned that repentance was not self-hatred, but honesty. That humility was not humiliation, but freedom. That love did not weaken conviction, it purified it. I learned that Christ did not ask me to pretend my past did not exist. He asked me to lay it down and stop letting it define me. I am not proud of who I was, but I am honest about him now. He reminds me of what certainty without love produces. He reminds me why truth must be embodied, not enforced. And he reminds me that transformation is not theoretical. It costs blood, tears, relationships, and safety. I tell you this not to shock you, and not to elevate myself. I tell you because I know what it is like to be certain and empty, disciplined and lost, convinced you are defending God while running from him. So I ask you, gently but directly, what if the thing you call faith is really fear wearing religious language? What if the strength you admire most is the one you have never allowed yourself to practice? What if surrender is not the end of you, but the beginning of your honesty? I once believed God needed my violence. Now I know he wanted my heart. And if he could stop a man like me in the middle of his certainty, I cannot help but wonder what he might be trying to interrupt in you.